I've been going on long-distance hikes in one way or another for as long as I can remember. My dad was a military veteran, and his brother was really into bow hunting, so most summers my father, uncle, cousins, and I would head out into the forests near Millwood, Georgia, for a few days of hiking and camping. After my dad passed, I found that being out in the wilderness made me feel closer to him, even if it was just a short afternoon hike on a Sunday. So, at least once or twice a month, I'd pack my gear and head into the woods to escape the stress of everyday life. At the time, I was living in Macon, and although there were some nice wooded areas near Hollow Bend, I preferred the trails between Carter Creek and Willows State Park since they reminded me of the forests I explored as a kid. Just to be clear, I'm talking about Carter Creek in Georgia, not the town in North Carolina. You could walk for miles out there without seeing anyone but the occasional fisherman. So most of the time, it was just me, the water, and the trees, peaceful and quiet. But one particular Sunday, after driving up from Macon, I was about 2 miles into my hike along Carter Creek when I noticed something unusual off to my left. Since I was used to seeing nothing but trees and the occasional squirrel, a large, dark shape immediately caught my attention. I stopped in my tracks and turned to get a better look. That's when I saw that someone had built a crude shelter by leaning dead branches against a tree. At first, I thought it was kind of neat. It had a slightly eerie, almost mystical vibe, but it was also impressive. Clearly, someone had been out there practicing survival skills. I kept walking for another 10 minutes or so before spotting another one, this time larger and more carefully assembled, with branches lashed together so it wouldn't fall apart easily. I had never come across anything like this on my previous hikes, and while they gave off an odd feeling, I wasn't concerned. Maybe some kids had tagged along with one of the fishermen the day before and built them for fun while their dad fished. But just as I had that thought, I spotted someone up ahead working on one of the shelters. As I got closer, I realized he looked to be in his mid-50s, around the same age my dad was when he passed. He had thinning gray hair pulled into a ponytail and wore brightly colored hiking gear. When he saw me approaching, he paused, waved, and greeted me with a friendly good afternoon. We chatted for a bit, and he introduced himself as Don. He told me he was practicing shelter building with the goal of spending the night out there under the stars. I joked that if he didn't perfect his technique soon, he'd end up staring at raindrops instead. We both laughed, and then I continued on my way. My usual routine was to hike to a certain point near Willows State Park and then retrace my steps. I thought I might see Don again on my way back, but I didn't. He must have moved on because his shelters were there, but he was nowhere in sight. Over the next few months, I went back to Carter Creek a few times, and although I never ran into Don again, I did see more of his work. Each time, there were new shelters, some bigger, others more refined. It was almost like we were communicating silently through his progress. That's why, on a particular hike in early September, I wasn't scared when I got the sense that someone else was in the woods with me. I was actually excited. I was walking parallel to the creek when I heard the distinct snap of a twig behind me. I turned, thinking maybe Don was nearby, and started walking toward the sound. I moved cautiously for a minute or two before realizing no one was there. I stopped, stood still for a moment, and then retraced my steps. If it wasn't Don making the noise, then something else had, something that might not have been as friendly. I always carried bear spray and a pistol just in case. I wasn't naive enough to think bear spray alone would protect me. After all, the scent can attract animals if you're not careful. And out in the wild, it's not just the animals you need to worry about. By the time I reached the outskirts of Willows State Park, I was certain something had been following me. I'm not just saying that out of paranoia. When a predator is nearby, the forest goes silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. That's how I knew something was out there. About half a mile from the nearest trailhead, I stopped, pulled out my pistol, and loaded it. I wasn't afraid of shooting, I was afraid of what I might have to aim at. I stood still for a minute, scanning the trees, before calling out, "Don, is that you?" Silence. Just to be safe, I added, "If someone's following me, you better stop now. I'm armed, and I know how to use this." Still, nothing moved, but I could feel eyes on me. I had two choices: take a longer, looping trail back to my car, adding nearly 2 hours to my hike, or retrace my steps while staying hyper-aware. Given my schedule, I opted for the latter. About halfway back, I passed two fly fishermen setting up near the creek. I asked if they'd seen anyone else on the trail, and they said yes, someone heading in the opposite direction. That confirmed it. Someone had definitely been behind me before turning back. I asked what the person looked like, expecting them to describe Don. They didn't. Instead, they described a man wearing camouflage, no fishing rod, no hunting gear, no safety vest. That unsettled me. The fisherman noticed my concern, so I explained that I felt like someone had been following me. They exchanged uneasy glances before mentioning that the man they'd seen hadn't spoken when they greeted him, just mumbled something unintelligible before walking on. I told them where my car was parked in case anything happened and then headed out. On my drive back to Macon, a chilling thought struck me. What if one of the fishermen had been the one stalking me? What if they had been pretending to be friendly but had actually turned back when I started acting cautious? That thought unsettled me more than anything. I decided right then that I would avoid Carter Creek for a while, but I never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. It was a deputy from the local sheriff's office in Georgia. At first, I thought I was in trouble for something minor, but then he asked if I had ever met someone building survival shelters near Carter Creek. He mentioned that he had already spoken to the fisherman and had traced me through security footage at the parking lot. My stomach dropped when he mentioned human remains. My first thought was that whatever had stalked me had attacked Don instead. But then the deputy clarified. There were two sets of remains, and neither of them belonged to anyone named Don. In fact, Don was now their prime suspect. The deputy asked if I had any information that could help locate him, but I had nothing useful to share. That was the last I heard about it. Years later, I still search for answers online, but I always come up empty-handed. Deep down, I think I already know what happened. I believe I narrowly escaped something horrible that day. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, a man. My name is Daniel. I'm 34 years old, and I've been living in Montana for the past 3 years. Just to be upfront, I didn't write this as a submission for your channel originally, but after stumbling across it in my recommendations and seeing that you take stories, I figured this was the perfect place to share my warning. I have no doubt that what you're about to read may unsettle or even scare you, but that isn't my goal. My only hope is that you and your audience take this seriously. I truly believe there is someone living off the grid deep in the Bitterroot National Forest, and I know for a fact that this person is incredibly dangerous. One of the reasons I moved from my home state of Oregon to Missoula, aside from financial reasons, was the sheer number of national forests within a short drive of the city. I was a Boy Scout growing up. My dad and uncles would take me and my cousins out every summer, and in college I joined a hiking group at Oregon State University. So when it came time to settle down somewhere new, Missoula climbed to the top of my list fast. It had everything I wanted: affordable living, city conveniences, and the kind of stunning wilderness that made Portland feel more like New York than the great outdoors. During my first year in Montana, I spent most of my time hiking in Lolo National Forest and the Rattlesnake Wilderness. But as time passed, I started venturing farther out to explore more of the region. I made trips to Helena National Forest, visited Flathead a few times, and eventually found myself in the Bitterroot Range. I returned to most of those places multiple times because, let's face it, you can't really know a place after just 1 or 2 hikes. But as for the Bitterroot, I only went once. If I ever manage to shake my fear of that place, you can be damn sure I'll still be avoiding the area between Trapper Peak and St. Mary's Peak. And if you value your safety, you should too. In the southern part of Bitterroot National Forest, there's a valley between Trapper and St. Mary's. At its westernmost edge, where 2 creeks converge, the land is open and bare. But as you move eastward, the trails begin to splinter off into a confusing network of narrow, winding paths. It reminded me of one of those old hedge mazes, like the kind in The Shining, but on a much larger scale. The trails all looked alike, bordered by rolling grassy slopes and thick pine groves that blocked your view. With the right gear and experience, it's almost impossible to get lost these days, but if there were ever a place to feel disoriented, this was it. I'd make a few turns, thinking I'd found my way back, only to end up at a dead end. For a less experienced hiker, that might have been a reason to worry, but for me, it was nostalgic. I hadn't been even close to lost in over 15 years, so the challenge was oddly exciting. It had been years since I'd felt that childhood sense of adventure while out in the woods. I kept exploring for about an hour, trying to familiarize myself with the area. Then, as I strolled down one particular stretch of trail, I picked up the distinct scent of campfire smoke. For a long time now, I've had the habit of introducing myself to any fellow hikers or campers I run into. Some might call it intrusive, but I see it as common courtesy and a safety precaution. The wilderness isn't a place where you want to go unnoticed. Part of it is just being friendly, exchanging pleasantries with like-minded outdoorsmen. But the other part is about awareness. I hike alone a lot, and while I always take precautions, I know I'm more vulnerable than most. So I make it a point to let people know I'm there and to gauge who I might be sharing the forest with. That way, if I pick up any bad vibes, I can make myself scarce before trouble starts. So when I smelled the campfire smoke, I assumed there was a camper nearby. The scent seemed to be coming from a slope to my right, so I veered off the trail a bit to investigate. Sure enough, the smell got stronger the further I walked, and before long, I found myself in a small clearing tucked away on a hillside. It was almost completely hidden from view, and just as I thought, this would be a great spot for a cabin, I saw that someone had already built one. About 50 yards away stood a small 2-room cabin, complete with a half-grown vegetable garden and a short wooden fence marking the perimeter. My first thought was, this can't be legal. Most national forests allow overnight camping, but permanent structures are strictly prohibited. Yet this cabin looked well built and had clearly been there for a while. So how had this person managed to stay off the radar for so long? As I stood there, marveling at the hidden dwelling, the cabin's front door suddenly swung open. Out stepped a bald man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a dirty tank top and a pair of worn-out jeans. His cabin had windows with shutters, yet he hadn't peeked outside before coming out. So when he spotted me, a startled look crossed his face, followed quickly by something far less welcoming. I realized I'd probably scared the guy, so I raised a hand in greeting to show I meant no harm. He didn't wave back. Instead, he disappeared inside for a brief moment, then re-emerged holding what looked like a bolt-action hunting rifle. I want to be clear, I wasn't trespassing. I never stepped over his makeshift fence, and I wasn't carrying a weapon in my hands. All he saw was some slightly overweight guy with glasses, a floppy hat, and a scruffy beard, and his first instinct was to grab a gun. The moment I saw that rifle, I turned and started walking back toward the tree line. As I did, I called out, "All right, I get the message. I'm leaving." Looking back, I should have just run. But in the moment, I figured that moving too quickly might make me seem suspicious. If I ran, he might assume I was a threat and take a shot at me. But if I walked away calmly, hands visible, he might let me go. I was armed at the time, nothing big, just a handgun for protection against wildlife. But the last thing I wanted was to escalate the situation into a gunfight in the middle of nowhere. Keeping my weapon holstered seemed like the best way to keep us both alive. But then he spoke. "You stay right where you are." The way he said it made my blood turn to ice. His voice had this eerie, commanding tone, like something straight out of a horror movie. I wanted to keep walking. Hell, I wanted to bolt, but it was like my feet had turned to stone. And that's when I realized, this guy wasn't just some harmless recluse. He was dangerous, and I might not make it out of there alive. A 30-year-old truck driver named Daniel Everett Wilson was living in Burlingame, Kansas, with his wife and 2 young children. They had recently moved into a brand new home, and Daniel's wife would later recall that it was the happiest time in their marriage. However, beneath the surface, something dark was brewing. Daniel was known among friends as a patient and level-headed man, but just weeks after embarking on this promising new chapter, he vanished without a trace. On Sunday, June 4th, 1996, A massive 18-wheeler barreled through the rugged terrain of Arizona's Coconino National Forest. The sound of its roaring engine was so deafening that two campers, Brian and Lisa Yarrington, paused their hike to investigate. As they approached the nearest roadway, they spotted the enormous truck veering wildly back and forth along a narrow stretch of road, moving at an alarming speed. The erratic driving sent a shiver down their spines. Another group of travelers, this time driving along the same road, had a terrifying encounter with the same semi-truck. They were forced to swerve off the road as the out-of-control vehicle hurtled toward them. Later, they recalled seeing the truck's mustached driver behind the wheel, his face disturbingly blank despite the near-fatal collision. That afternoon, a group of people on their way to a picnic came across the abandoned truck, which had swerved off the road and become stuck in a field. One of them, a man named Charles Hale, stepped out of the car and approached the driver, offering assistance. The trucker's response was both cryptic and chilling. "They made me do it," he muttered as if answering an unspoken question. Confused, Charles asked, "Who made you do what?" The driver's expression turned frantic. "No, you can't help. No one can. I'll never get it out of there. I'm going to jail." The mention of jail alarmed Charles. Realizing the situation could be serious, he quickly left but later contacted the local sheriff's department, reporting the unsettling encounter to Deputy Rick Wallace. Deputy Wallace was puzzled by why such a large vehicle had been navigating treacherous forest roads. Upon arrival at the scene, he found the semi-truck stuck in thick mud near a clearing not far from Forest Route 167 in the Mogollon Rim area. Peering into the truck's locked cab, he saw that the interior was clean and orderly, with no apparent signs of foul play. The cargo inside the truck remained untouched, 1,200 crates of lettuce and berries, still being kept cool by the refrigeration unit. Checking the National Crime Database, Wallace found no reports of a missing driver or stolen truck. Later that same day, Brian and Lisa Yarrington were driving along a remote section of Forest Route 294 when they spotted a man standing among the trees. As they slowed down, they noticed he was kneeling on the ground, staring at a tree while murmuring under his breath. His words were indecipherable, and when Brian asked if he needed help, the man responded vaguely, "I have to light the fire." To their horror, the man then pulled a $10 bill from his pocket, placed it on a rock, and repeatedly struck it with another stone, as if trying to start a fire. Alarmed, the couple backed away toward their car, but the man suddenly let out an unintelligible scream and hurled the rock at them. Terrified, they fled the scene. It was only later that authorities confirmed the man was the missing truck driver, Daniel Wilson. Tragically, that was the last time he was ever seen alive. When Daniel failed to check in with his company and was known never to abandon a shipment, his co-workers reported him missing. Investigators retraced his steps and discovered that he had left home on May 29th, heading west on a familiar route. He had successfully delivered his shipment in California, reloaded his truck for the return trip, and even checked in with his boss, Greg Waller. Greg later reported that Daniel seemed perfectly fine, alert, on time, and exhibiting no odd behavior. However, during his final call on the night of June 3rd, Daniel mentioned struggling with insomnia. His boss asked if he could continue the journey safely, and Daniel reassured him that he could. However, records indicate he never left Arizona. Detective Bruce Morton, assigned to the case, later admitted that Daniel's disappearance was deeply perplexing. He had no history of drug use, criminal activity, or mental illness, leaving authorities without a clear explanation for his bizarre behavior. Some theorized that he had vanished voluntarily, as certain personal belongings were missing from the truck. A massive search effort followed, involving foot patrols, search dogs, off-road vehicles, and dozens of volunteers. Search teams scoured the forest, looking for clothing fragments or bones, but no trace of Daniel was found. This was particularly eerie, as the rescue team had never failed to recover a missing person, until Daniel Wilson. 2 years later, on April 15, 1998, two hikers exploring the base of the Mogollon Rim stumbled upon a human skull. Dental records later confirmed the worst. It belonged to the missing trucker, Daniel Wilson. Although the skull was damaged, The coroner was unable to determine whether the cause was a violent act or natural decomposition due to scavengers. Some experts suggested Daniel may have suffered a diabetic episode, while others proposed sleep deprivation or a mental breakdown as possible explanations. Some even speculated he had been exposed to carbon monoxide poisoning from a leak in his truck's cabin, though no definitive proof was found. Daniel's wife, Elaine Wilson, still longs for answers. Over the years, her hope for a definitive explanation of his fate has slowly faded. She recalls that when Daniel was first reported missing, the uncertainty was agonizing for their children. The discovery of his remains brought a form of closure, but many questions remained unanswered. Why did Daniel veer so far off course? If his mind was affected, what triggered such a drastic shift in behavior? Some believe he had a sudden breakdown, while others suggest he was running from something terrifying. But the most chilling question remains. If fear drove Daniel into the wilderness, what exactly was he so desperately trying to escape?